I entered a stranger's hotel room that rainy night in Bath, and it would cost me everything I thought I knew about love and dignity. What I could not have known then, shivering in my wet clothes and clutching my worn traveling bag, was that my mistake would lead me to the one man capable of teaching me that some prices are worth paying. The rain had not ceased for 3 days. It drummed against the cobblestones of Bath with a relentless persistence that seemed almost personal, as though the heavens themselves had decided to mirror the turmoil in my heart. I had traveled from London on the last train, my ticket purchased with coins I had counted and recounted in the dim light of my rented room, each penny a small surrender of the independence I had fought so hard to maintain since my father's death. My name is Cecily Ashford, and at 23 years of age, I had already learned more about loss than most women learn in a lifetime. My father, Theodore Ashford, had been a watchmaker of considerable skill and modest reputation. His shop on Clerkenwell Road had been my childhood kingdom, a place of tiny gears and gleaming brass, of patient hands and the eternal tick of 100 clocks marking time in their wooden cases. I had learned to read by the light of his workbench lamp, had learned to count by sorting watch crystals into velvet-lined boxes, had learned to love by watching him polish each timepiece as though it were a living thing deserving of tenderness. But time, that cruel master my father had served so faithfully, had not been kind to us. His eyes had begun to fail when I was 19, the fine work that had sustained us becoming impossible for his trembling hands. The debts had accumulated like dust in corners we could no longer see to clean, and when he died 2 years later, peacefully in his sleep with my hand in his, I discovered that the shop, the house, and everything we had ever owned belonged to creditors whose patience had run thin. I sold what I could. I pawned my mother's ring, the one he had made for her with his own hands before I was born. I took work as a seamstress, then as a mender of fine garments, then as whatever anyone would pay me to do that allowed me to keep my dignity and my honor intact. I had lived in 4 different boarding houses in 2 years, each one smaller and darker than the last, each one a reminder of how far I had fallen from the girl who had once believed that love and hard work were enough to sustain a life. The journey to Bath had been a desperate gamble. Mrs. Pemberton, the dressmaker who occasionally sent work my way, had mentioned that a wealthy household in the countryside was seeking a seamstress for an extended commission. The pay was generous, the room and board included, and the position would last through the spring and summer seasons. It was more security than I had known in years, and I had scraped together every coin I possessed to make the journey and present myself for consideration. But the train had been delayed by the storms, and I had arrived in Bath well past the hour when I had planned to find modest lodgings and prepare for my interview the following morning. The Grand Crescent Hotel had been the first establishment I had encountered with its doors still open and lights burning in the windows. I had known, even as I approached its elegant facade, that it was far beyond my means, but the clerk at the desk had taken pity on my bedraggled state and offered me what he called a reduced rate for a small room on the 4th floor. I had paid him the last of my coins, accepted the key he pressed into my palm, and climbed the stairs with legs that trembled from exhaustion and cold. The hallway was dim, lit only by gas lamps that flickered in their sconces, and the numbers on the doors seemed to swim before my tired eyes. I found what I believed to be my room, turned the key in the lock, and stepped inside without bothering to light a candle. The room was warm, gloriously warm, with a fire burning low in the grate. I remember thinking that the hotel must be more generous than I had expected as I set down my bag and removed my sodden cloak. The furniture was merely shapes in the darkness, but I could make out a settee near the fire, and I sank onto it with a gratitude that bordered on tears. I would rest for just a moment, I told myself, just long enough to stop shivering. Then I would properly examine my surroundings and prepare for bed. I did not remember closing my eyes. When I opened them again, the fire had burned to embers and pale gray light was seeping through curtains, far finer than any that should have adorned a reduced rate room on the 4th floor. I sat up slowly, my neck stiff from sleeping in an awkward position. And as my vision adjusted to the dawn light, I realized with growing horror that I was not in the room I had been assigned. This room was a suite, lavishly appointed with furniture that spoke of old money and impeccable taste. The settee upon which I had slept was upholstered in deep burgundy velvet, and the carpet beneath my feet was thick enough to muffle any sound. Oil paintings hung on the walls, portraits of stern-faced men and elegant women whose eyes seemed to follow me as I rose unsteadily and tried to make sense of my situation. And then I saw the door to the adjoining chamber, and I saw that it was open, and I saw the man standing in its frame watching me with an expression of cold astonishment. He was tall, perhaps a full head taller than any man I had ever stood beside, with dark hair that fell across a forehead creased with displeasure. His features were sharp, aristocratic, the kind of face that artists paint and poets write about, but there was nothing soft or romantic in the way he looked at me. He wore a dressing gown of deep blue silk, and his feet were bare, and everything about his posture suggested that he was a man accustomed to having his displeasure taken very seriously indeed. I opened my mouth to speak, to explain, to apologize, but no words came. What could I possibly say? I had invaded a stranger's private chambers, had slept uninvited on his furniture, and was now standing before him in a dress still damp from yesterday's rain, with my hair falling loose around my shoulders like some sort of mad woman escaped from an asylum. He spoke first, his voice low and controlled in a way that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. He asked me who I was and how I had come to be in his rooms, and his tone made it clear that he expected a satisfactory answer and was prepared to summon the authorities if he did not receive one. I found my voice then, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. I told him my name. I told him about the train and the rain and the clerk and the key. I told him that I had been exhausted and confused and that the door had opened with the key I had been given, and I had assumed, and I was so terribly, desperately sorry. He listened without interrupting, his expression unchanging, his dark eyes fixed on my face as though he were trying to determine whether I was a liar or simply a fool. When I finished speaking, the silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the rain still falling against the windows and the distant sound of servants moving in the corridor outside. Then a door opened somewhere behind him, and a woman's voice called out, sharp and imperious, asking Benedict what on earth was happening and who was that person standing in his sitting room. The woman who emerged from the inner chamber was perhaps 60 years of age, dressed in a morning gown of pale lavender silk that somehow managed to look more regal than any ball gown I had ever seen. Her silver hair was arranged in perfect waves, and her eyes, the same dark shade as the man's, assessed me with the kind of thorough scrutiny that made me feel as though she could see through my skin to the very bones beneath. She was Lady Eugenia Hale, Dowager Duchess of Ashworth, and the man was her son, Lord Benedict Hale, the current Duke. I learned these things in the conversation that followed, a conversation during which I stood mute and mortified while the Dowager questioned the hotel staff and examined my pathetic traveling bag, and determined, through means I still do not entirely understand, that I was telling the truth about my circumstances. The clerk who had given me my key was summoned and interrogated until he confessed that he had made an error, that the room numbers had been transposed in his ledger due to his own fatigue, and that I had been given the key to the Duke's suite rather than the modest chamber I had actually rented. He begged forgiveness. He offered to return my payment. He promised that nothing like this would ever happen again. The Duke dismissed him with a wave of his hand, and I expected that I too would be dismissed, sent away with nothing but my shame and my ruined prospects. But the Dowager had other ideas. She asked me to sit. Her tone did not suggest that this was a request. I sat. She asked me about my circumstances, my family, my education, my skills. She asked me why I'd come to Bath and what I hoped to accomplish. She asked me if I had any connections to society, any relatives of consequence, any reason whatsoever that anyone in the world would recognize my name or my face. I answered honestly, because I had nothing left to lose. I told her that I was the daughter of a bankrupt watchmaker, that I had no family and no connections, that I survived by the work of my hands and the grace of God, and that I had come to Bath seeking a position as a seamstress because it was the only opportunity I had been offered in months. The Dowager listened to everything I said with an expression that gave nothing away. When I finished, she looked at her son, and some silent communication passed between them that I could not interpret. Then she looked back at me, and she smiled. And something about that smile made me more nervous than all her questions had. She told me that she had a proposition. Her son, she explained, was in need of a wife. Not a real wife, she hastened to add, seeing the alarm that must have shown on my face. A temporary wife. A fiction. A performance designed to satisfy the demands of society and silence the whispers that had plagued their family for the past 2 years. I did not understand, and I said so. The Dowager sighed, and for the first time I saw something like weariness in her aristocratic features. She told me the story then, the story that all of London apparently knew, but that had never reached the ears of a seamstress living in rented rooms in Cheapside. 2 years ago, Lord Benedict Hale had been engaged to marry Lady Arabella Vance, the daughter of an earl and one of the most celebrated beauties of her season. The wedding had been planned, the guests had been invited, and then, 3 days before the ceremony, Lady Arabella had vanished. She had run away with the Duke's own brother, Lord Marcus Hale, and the two of them had eloped to the continent, leaving behind nothing but a brief note and a scandal that had rocked society to its foundations. The Duke had been publicly humiliated. The family name had been dragged through every drawing room and gossip column in England. And although 2 years had passed, although Lord Marcus and Lady Arabella had married and settled somewhere in Italy, the whispers had never entirely stopped. The Duke was an object of pity and speculation. The Duke had been abandoned. The Duke was clearly incapable of inspiring loyalty or love. And now, the Dowager explained, the family faced a new crisis. There was to be a royal celebration in London that spring, and the Duke's presence was required. But he could not appear alone, could not continue to be the subject of pitying glances and cruel jokes. He needed a wife at his side, even a temporary one, even a false one, to demonstrate to the world that he had moved on, that he had found happiness, that he was no longer the pathetic figure they had made of him. She looked at me with those sharp, dark eyes, and she named her price. £10,000, she said, £10,000 to pose as the Duchess of Ashworth for 3 months, to attend balls and dinners and garden parties on the Duke's arm, to smile and charm and pretend to be hopelessly in love with a man I had never met before this morning. And when the season was over, I would be free to go, with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I should have refused. I know that now, just as I knew it then. I should have stood up and walked out of that hotel suite and never looked back. But £10,000. £10,000 was more money than my father had earned in his entire lifetime. £10,000 was freedom from want, from fear, from the constant gnawing anxiety of wondering where my next meal would come from. £10,000 was everything I had ever dreamed of and never dared to hope for. I looked at the Duke, this cold and silent man who had watched our entire exchange without uttering a single word. His face was unreadable, a mask of aristocratic indifference, but there was something in his eyes that caught my attention. Something wounded, something that reminded me, improbably, of myself. I asked him if this was truly what he wanted. He did not answer for a long moment. Then he said, in that low, controlled voice, that what he wanted was irrelevant. What mattered was what was necessary. And if I agreed to his mother's terms, he would ensure that I was treated with respect and provided with everything I needed to play my role convincingly. It was not a romantic declaration. It was not even particularly kind. But there was honesty in it, and after years of false promises and broken hopes, honesty was worth more to me than kindness. I said yes. The word hung in the air between us, heavier than I had expected, weighted with implications I was only beginning to understand. The Dowager nodded once, as though she had never doubted my answer, and immediately began issuing instructions to servants I had not even noticed were present. The Duke said nothing at all, merely inclined his head in acknowledgement and retreated to the inner chamber, closing the door behind him with a soft click that somehow felt like a judgment. I sat alone for a long moment after they had both departed, trying to comprehend what I had just agreed to. £10,000, 3 months. A lie that would require me to inhabit the skin of someone I was not, to walk through ballrooms and gardens as though I belonged there, to look into the eyes of society's elite and convince them that I was one of their own. It seemed impossible. It seemed terrifying. And yet, beneath the fear, I felt something else stirring. Something that might have been excitement, or might have been hope, or might have been simple desperation dressed up in finer clothes. I thought of my father then, of the way he had always encouraged me to be brave, to face my challenges head-on rather than shrinking from them. What would he say if he could see me now? Would he be proud of my courage or ashamed of my deception? I did not know. I would never know. And that uncertainty, more than anything else, made me want to weep. But there was no time for weeping. The transformation had already begun. The first seamstress arrived within the hour, a thin woman with spectacles perched on her nose and a measuring tape draped around her neck like a physician's stethoscope. She circled me slowly, making notes in a small leather book, murmuring to herself about proportions and colors and styles that would suit my complexion. I stood motionless, arms extended, feeling like a dressmaker's dummy rather than a woman, and I wondered if this was how I would feel for the next 3 months, like an object to be draped and displayed rather than a person with thoughts and feelings of her own. More artisans followed. A milliner who tutted over the state of my hair and declared that something must be done immediately. A cobbler who measured my feet and promised shoes that would make me feel as though I were walking on clouds. A jeweler who brought cases of glittering treasures from which the Dowager selected pieces with the confident authority of a general deploying troops. By the time night fell, I had been measured, assessed, critiqued, and catalogued in more ways than I had thought possible. I had been dressed in 3 different gowns, each more elaborate than the last, had my hair arranged in 4 different styles, had practiced walking in shoes with heels higher than any I had ever worn. My feet ached, my head throbbed, and still the Dowager was not satisfied. She must learn to speak properly, the Dowager announced, to no one in particular, though her eyes were fixed on me. Her accent is acceptable, but her vocabulary is limited. We shall need a tutor. I wanted to protest that my vocabulary was perfectly adequate, that I had read more books than most women of my station, that my father had insisted on education even when we could barely afford food. But the Dowager's expression did not invite argument, and so I held my tongue and added resentment to the list of emotions I was struggling to contain. The tutor arrived the following morning, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Harrington, who had apparently spent years teaching the daughters of minor nobility how to converse at dinner parties without embarrassing their families. He was patient and kind, far kinder than the Dowager, and he seemed to understand without being told that I was not stupid, merely untrained in the peculiar arts of aristocratic discourse. We spent hours each day practicing the verbal patterns of high society. I learned which topics were appropriate for mixed company and which were reserved for gentlemen or ladies alone. I learned the subtle art of saying nothing while appearing to say everything, of deflecting questions I did not wish to answer, of complimenting without seeming sycophantic and criticizing without seeming cruel. I learned that the truth, in these circles, was rarely spoken directly. That meaning lay in pauses and glances and the careful arrangement of words that could be interpreted in multiple ways. It was exhausting. It was fascinating. And slowly, so slowly, I barely noticed it happening. I began to transform into someone I did not quite recognize. The transformation began that very day. The Dowager summoned dressmakers and milliners and hairdressers to the hotel suite, and I was measured and fitted and trimmed and polished until I barely recognized the woman who stared back at me from the mirror. My simple brown dress was replaced with gowns of silk and satin in colors I had only ever seen in shop windows. My calloused hands were softened with creams and covered with gloves of the finest kid leather. My hair, which I had always worn in a simple knot at the nape of my neck, was arranged in elaborate styles that required more pins than I could count. But the physical transformation was only the beginning. The Dowager spent hours each day instructing me in the ways of society, teaching me which fork to use at dinner and how to curtsy to royalty and what subjects were appropriate for conversation and which ones must never be mentioned under any circumstances. She drilled me on the names and titles of everyone we were likely to encounter, on the complex web of alliances and rivalries that governed the upper classes, on the subtle art of saying nothing while appearing to say everything. And through it all, the Duke remained distant. He took his meals separately and spent his days attending to business that I was not privy to. When we did encounter each other in the shared spaces of the suite, he was courteous but cold, addressing me with the formal politeness one might offer a stranger on the street. I told myself that this was for the best, that emotional distance would make our arrangement easier to maintain and easier to end. But there were moments, brief and fleeting, when I caught him watching me with an expression I could not quite decipher, and something in my chest would tighten in a way that worried me. We traveled to London 3 weeks after our agreement, installed in Ashworth House, the family's grand townhome in Mayfair. The journey itself was an education, my first experience of traveling in the manner of the aristocracy rather than in the cramped public carriages I had known all my life. The Duke's private coach was a marvel of comfort, its seats upholstered in leather so soft it felt like touching water, its windows hung with curtains that could be drawn against the dust or opened to admit the pale spring sunshine. We stopped at coaching inns, where the proprietors rushed to meet us, where private rooms were prepared and meals were served on china so fine I was afraid to touch it. The Dowager used these hours to continue my instruction, drilling me on the family history of the Hales, on the layout of Ashworth House, on the names and faces of servants I would be expected to recognize. The Duke sat in silence across from us, reading a book or staring out the window at the passing countryside. And I found my eyes drawn to him more often than was proper. There was something about his profile, about the way the light fell across his features, that made me want to understand what thoughts lay behind that impassive facade. Once, when the Dowager had dozed off with her head against the velvet squabs, I caught him looking at me with an expression I could not interpret. Our eyes met, and for a moment, neither of us looked away. Then he returned to his book, and I returned to my contemplation of the fields rolling past our window, and the moment passed as though it had never happened. But I remembered it. In the weeks that followed, I remembered it often. The house was magnificent, all marble floors and gilded ceilings and windows that looked out over gardens, tended by an army of servants. I stood in the entrance hall on my first morning, craning my neck to stare at the painted ceiling above me, where gods and goddesses cavorted in a blue sky dotted with clouds, and I felt so small, so insignificant, that I wanted nothing more than to flee back to the modest room I had rented in Cheapside and forget this entire mad adventure had ever happened. The house was larger than any building I had ever entered, larger than some of the streets I had lived on. There were rooms for receiving morning callers, and rooms for receiving afternoon callers, and rooms that were used only for formal dinners, and rooms that were used only for intimate family suppers. There were galleries hung with paintings that must have been worth more than my father's shop had earned in a decade, and libraries filled with books that I longed to explore, but was too intimidated to touch. There were servants everywhere, silent and efficient, who seemed to appear whenever I needed something and disappear the moment I noticed them. I learned the geography of the house slowly, getting lost more times than I cared to admit, taking wrong turns that led me to servants' quarters or storage rooms, or once, memorably, to the Duke's private study, where I found him reading at his desk and stammered an apology before fleeing like a startled deer. The Dowager assigned a footman to escort me for the first few days. A patient young man named Thomas, who answered my endless questions without ever making me feel foolish for asking them. I was given my own suite of rooms, beautifully appointed and larger than any of the boarding houses I had lived in since my father's death. A lady's maid named Helena was assigned to attend me, a quiet young woman with clever hands and kind eyes who never asked questions about why the new Duchess had no possessions of her own and no knowledge of how to dress herself properly. Our first public appearance was at a ball hosted by the Countess of Merryweather, a glittering affair held in a ballroom decorated with thousands of candles and fresh flowers brought from the continent. The preparations for that evening had taken most of the day, Helena working her magic on my hair while the Dowager supervised from a chair in the corner, offering corrections and suggestions that Helena accepted with unfailing grace. My gown was pale blue silk, the color of a summer sky just before dusk, and it fit my body like it had been made for me, which of course it had. The Dowager had spared no expense in creating my wardrobe, and while I knew intellectually that the gowns would belong to the family rather than to me, I could not help feeling a thrill of pleasure each time I saw myself in the mirror, looking like someone I had only ever imagined in dreams. The carriage ride to the Merryweather residence was silent, the Duke staring out one window while I stared out the other, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I was rehearsing everything the Dowager had taught me, running through names and faces and appropriate conversational topics, trying to calm the panic that threatened to overwhelm me. I had never been to a ball before. I had never danced with a gentleman. I had never worn a gown that cost more than I used to earn in a year. And now I was supposed to walk into a room full of the most important people in England and convince them that I was one of their own. When we arrived, the house was ablaze with light, every window glowing golden against the dark spring evening. Carriages lined the street, disgorging their elegant passengers, and the sound of music drifted through the open doors like a siren song. I felt the Duke's hand close around mine, steadying me, and I looked up to find him watching me with an expression that might have been concern. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. I wanted to say no. I wanted to say that I would never be ready, that this was madness, that I was a seamstress pretending to be a duchess, and everyone would see through me the moment I opened my mouth. But I looked into his dark eyes, saw something there that I could not quite name, and I found myself nodding. "I am ready," I said, and I almost believed it. I remember standing at the entrance to that room, my hand resting on the Duke's arm, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain everyone could hear it. The Dowager had assured me that I looked the part, that no one would question my right to be there, but I felt like an imposter, a fraud wrapped in borrowed silk and pretending to be something I could never truly become. The Duke must have sensed my fear, because he leaned down and spoke quietly in my ear. He told me to remember that these people were not my betters, merely my audience. He told me that I had nothing to prove to them and nothing to fear from them. And then, before I could respond, he led me into the room, and the crowd parted before us like the sea before a ship. The whispers began immediately, a rustling tide of speculation and surprise. I heard fragments of conversation as we passed, voices wondering who this mysterious woman was, where she had come from, how she had managed to capture the Duke of Ashworth after his very public humiliation. But there were also other voices, voices expressing admiration for my gown and curiosity about my origins and envy for the match I had apparently made. The story we had prepared, that I was the daughter of a gentleman who had lost his fortune abroad, seemed to satisfy most inquiries, and those who were not satisfied were too polite to press further. I danced that night for the first time in my life, the Duke guiding me through the steps with a patience I had not expected from him. He was a skilled dancer, his movements precise and graceful, and when he held me close for a waltz, I found myself acutely aware of the warmth of his hand on my waist and the steadiness of his gaze on my face. "This is performance," I reminded myself. This is pretense. But my body did not seem to understand the difference, and my cheeks flushed with a heat that had nothing to do with the crowded room. The waltz carried us around the perimeter of the ballroom, past glittering chandeliers and columns wrapped in flowers, past matrons who watched us with calculating eyes, and young ladies who watched the Duke with something like longing. I tried to focus on the steps, to remember everything the dance master had taught me in our brief intensive lessons, but the Duke made it easy. His lead was firm but gentle, guiding me through the movements as though we had danced together 1,000 times before. "You dance well," he said, and there was surprise in his voice that I tried not to find insulting. "I had a good teacher," I replied, thinking of the patient dance master who had spent 3 days trying to instill in me the basics of ballroom deportment, and a tolerant partner. Something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been amusement. "I am told I am many things," he said, "but tolerant is not usually among them." "Then perhaps I bring out your better nature," I said, and immediately wished I could take the words back. They were too familiar, too flirtatious, too much like something a real wife might say to her husband. But the Duke did not seem offended. If anything, the ghost of a smile touched his lips, and when the dance ended and he released me, his hand lingered on mine for just a moment longer than necessary. "Perhaps you do," he said quietly, and then the next dance was beginning, and another gentleman was requesting my hand, and the moment dissolved like morning mist in the sun. We spoke more that night than we had in all the weeks preceding. Between dances, standing at the edge of the ballroom with glasses of champagne neither of us actually drank, we talked about inconsequential things, the weather, the music, the elaborate decorations. But there were moments when the conversation turned deeper, when he asked me about my life before our arrangement, and listened to my answers with what seemed like genuine interest. I told him about my father and his watches, about the shop on Clerkenwell Road, about the way time had seemed to move differently in that place, slower and more precious. And he told me, haltingly, about his own father, who had died when Benedict was still at university, who had left behind an estate burdened with debt and a family fractured by grief. I began to understand, in the weeks that followed, that the Duke of Ashworth was not the cold and heartless man I had initially believed him to be. He was guarded, yes, and proud, and reluctant to show vulnerability of any kind. But beneath that carefully constructed exterior was a man who had been deeply wounded, not only by his brother's betrayal, but by years of carrying responsibilities too heavy for any single pair of shoulders. He had rebuilt the family fortune through shrewd investments and careful management. He had paid off his father's debts and restored the estate to prosperity. He had done everything that was expected of him, and more, and his reward had been public humiliation at the hands of the two people he had trusted most in the world. I discovered these things in fragments, pieced together from conversations with servants and observations of my own. The housekeeper, Mrs. Thornton, spoke of him with a loyalty that bordered on devotion, telling me how he had kept on the entire household staff when other lords would have dismissed them to save money. The butler, Jennings, mentioned casually that the Duke had personally funded the education of 3 promising young men from the village, asking nothing in return but their promise to work hard and make something of themselves. Even Helena, my quiet lady's maid, let slip that the Duke had intervened when her brother was facing debtor's prison, arranging for the debts to be paid and the young man to be given honest work on one of the estate farms. These were not the actions of a cold man. These were the actions of a man who cared deeply, but had learned to hide that caring behind walls of reserve and formality. And the more I learned about him, the more I wanted to understand him, to see behind those walls to the person who lived within. I found myself thinking about him more than was wise. In the quiet hours of the morning, when Helena was styling my hair and the house was still, my thoughts would drift to the way he had smiled at something I had said the night before, or the gentle pressure of his hand guiding me through a crowded room, or the look in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. These were dangerous thoughts, I knew, Our arrangement was temporary, a business transaction with clearly defined terms. He was a duke, and I was nobody, and whatever feelings might be stirring in my heart had no place in the world we had constructed together. But the heart is not easily governed by logic, and as the weeks passed and spring turned the parks of London green and fragrant, I found it increasingly difficult to remember that I was playing a role. The change in the Duke was subtle at first, noticeable only to someone who spent as much time in his company as I did. He began to seek me out in the afternoons, suggesting walks in the garden or drives through Hyde Park. Our conversations grew longer and more personal, touching on subjects that went beyond the superficial requirements of our public performance. He asked me about my dreams, my fears, my hopes for the future. He told me about his own struggles, his loneliness, his sense that he had spent his entire adult life being what others needed him to be, rather than discovering who he actually was. One evening, after a particularly tedious dinner party at the home of a marquis whose wife had spent the entire meal making pointed comments about inappropriate matches and social climbing, the Duke found me in the library of Ashworth House. I was sitting in a window seat, watching the rain streak down the glass, trying to calm the anger that still burned in my chest. The Marchioness's remarks had been clearly directed at me, and although I had smiled and nodded and pretended not to understand, the cruelty of her words had cut deeper than I wanted to admit. The Duke sat beside me without asking permission, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him through the silk of my sleeve. He asked me what I was thinking, and I told him the truth. I told him that I was tired of pretending, tired of being looked at with suspicion and condescension, tired of knowing that no matter how perfectly I played my part, I would never truly belong in his world. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than I had ever heard it. He told me that belonging was overrated. He told me that he had belonged to this world his entire life, and it had brought him nothing but disappointment and betrayal. He told me that the only moments of genuine happiness he had experienced in recent memory had been the moments he spent with me, and he did not think that was an accident. I turned to look at him then, truly look at him, and what I saw in his face made my breath catch in my throat. There was no coldness there, no aristocratic distance. There was only a man, vulnerable and uncertain, asking without words for something he was afraid to name. I should have pulled away. I should have reminded him of our agreement, of the £10,000, of the life I would return to when our 3 months were over. But I did not pull away. I sat perfectly still as he reached out and touched my cheek with fingers that trembled slightly, and I closed my eyes as he leaned forward and pressed his lips to mine. The kiss was gentle, questioning, giving me every opportunity to refuse. I did not refuse. I kissed him back with all the longing I had been trying so desperately to suppress, and when we finally broke apart, both of us breathless and shaking, I knew that everything had changed. We did not speak of what had happened, not that night, and not in the days that followed. But something had shifted between us, some barrier had fallen, and we could not pretend otherwise. He looked at me differently now, with a warmth that was impossible to mistake, and I found myself leaning into that warmth, craving it, dreading the day when it would be taken from me. The Dowager noticed the change. Of course she did. She noticed everything. But to my surprise, she did not object or warn me against developing genuine feelings. Instead, she watched us with an expression that might have been satisfaction, and once, when she thought I was not looking, I saw her smile to herself in a way that made me wonder if she had planned this outcome all along. But happiness, I had learned, is a fragile thing, easily shattered by forces beyond our control. Lady Arabella Vance returned to London in the middle of May. I learned of her arrival from the whispers at a garden party, hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when I approached and resumed as soon as I was out of earshot. She had left Italy after the death of her husband, Lord Marcus Hale, who had succumbed to a fever the previous winter. She was in mourning, yes, but she was also in London, and she was asking questions about her former fiancé and his new wife. The Duke's reaction to this news was immediate and visceral. He withdrew from me, from everyone, retreating behind the walls I had thought he had begun to dismantle. He spent long hours alone in his study, and when we appeared together at social functions, his smiles were strained and his eyes were always scanning the crowd, looking for a face he clearly dreaded seeing. I told myself that his distress was understandable. This was the woman who had humiliated him, who had run away with his brother on the eve of their wedding, who had made him an object of ridicule throughout all of England. Of course he was unsettled by her return. Of course he needed time to compose himself. But there was a voice in the back of my mind, a small and terrified voice that whispered other possibilities. Perhaps he still loved her. Perhaps he had never stopped loving her. Perhaps everything that had grown between us was nothing more than a distraction, a temporary solace that would evaporate the moment the woman he truly wanted came back into his life. I tried to ignore that voice, but it grew louder with each passing day. The confrontation I had been dreading came at a ball hosted by the Duke of Pemberton, a lavish affair that marked the height of the season. I was standing near the refreshment table, momentarily separated from Benedict, when I felt someone watching me. I turned and found myself face to face with the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. Lady Arabella was everything I was not. Tall and willowy, with golden hair and eyes the color of a summer sky, she moved through the world with the confidence of someone who had never known want or rejection. Her morning dress was impeccably cut, its black silk serving only to highlight the perfection of her complexion. And the string of pearls at her throat probably cost more than everything I had ever owned combined. She was beautiful in a way that seemed almost unfair, the kind of beauty that painters try to capture and poets try to describe, and ordinary women despair of ever approaching. Standing next to her, I felt every inch the imposter I was, a seamstress in borrowed finery playing a role I had no right to claim. She must have seen it in my face, that flash of inadequacy, because her smile widened, becoming something sharp and predatory. She introduced herself, as though I could possibly be ignorant of her identity, and she complimented my gown with words that somehow managed to sound like insults. "Such an interesting color," she said, tilting her head as though examining a curiosity. "I would not have thought it would suit your complexion, but I suppose with enough candlelight anything is possible." I murmured something polite, I do not remember what, while my mind raced through possible responses and rejected them all as inadequate. This was a battle I was not equipped to fight, a war of words and implications that I had never been trained for. The Dowager's lessons had prepared me for ordinary social encounters, not for confrontations with women who wished me harm. Then she leaned close, close enough that no one else could hear, and she told me that she knew. The words fell into my consciousness like stones into still water, sending ripples of panic through every part of me. She knew. She knew I was not truly the Duchess of Ashworth. She knew that I was a seamstress, a nobody, a fraud who had been hired to play a part. She had friends in Bath, she explained, friends who had heard rumors about a strange incident at the Grand Crescent Hotel, and who had been only too happy to investigate on her behalf. She had evidence, letters and testimonies, enough to destroy me and humiliate the Duke all over again. I stood frozen, unable to speak, unable to breathe. All I could think was that it was over. Everything was over. The Duke would be ruined, the Dowager would be mortified, and I would be exposed as the fortune-hunting impostor that society had always suspected me of being. But Lady Arabella was not finished. She did not want to expose me, she said. Not yet. What she wanted was far simpler. She wanted me to step aside. She wanted the Duke back, wanted the position and prestige she had thrown away 2 years ago. Her husband was dead, her reputation was tarnished, and her only hope of reclaiming her place in society was to marry the man she should have married in the first place. Give him up, she said. Disappear. Take your £10,000 and go back to whatever hovel you crawled out of. And I will keep your secret forever. I do not know how long I stood there, staring at her perfect, beautiful face, feeling my world crumble around me. It might have been seconds or it might have been hours, but eventually I became aware of a presence beside me, a familiar warmth, and I turned to find Benedict standing there, his face pale and his eyes fixed on Lady Arabella with an expression I could not read. She greeted him with the easy familiarity of old acquaintance, reaching out to touch his arm, telling him how wonderful it was to see him again, how much she had missed him, how desperately she hoped they could find time to speak privately. She did not mention our conversation. She did not need to. The threat hung in the air between us, invisible but inescapable. The Duke was courteous, as he always was, but I could feel the tension in his body, the way he positioned himself slightly in front of me as though shielding me from something. He told Lady Arabella that he was pleased to see her well, that he was sorry for her loss, and that he hoped she would find happiness in whatever the future held. Then he placed his hand on the small of my back and guided me away from her, through the crowd, out onto a terrace overlooking the moonlit garden. We stood in silence for a long moment, the cool night air washing over us, the sounds of the ball muffled by the closed doors behind us. Then he asked me what she had said. I could have lied. I could have claimed that it was nothing, that we had simply exchanged pleasantries, that there was nothing to worry about. But I was tired of pretending, tired of secrets, tired of being anything other than exactly what I was. I told him everything, about the threat, about the evidence, about her demand that I step aside. I told him that I would understand if he wanted to end our arrangement early, that I would not hold him to any promises, that I would disappear quietly and never trouble him again. He listened without interrupting, his face shadowed in the moonlight, his expression impossible to read. When I finished speaking, he was quiet for so long that I began to fear I had lost him, that whatever had grown between us had not been strong enough to survive this revelation. Then he reached out and took my hands in his, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. He told me that he did not want me to disappear. He told me that the thought of losing me filled him with a despair he had not felt since the darkest days after his brother's betrayal. He told me that he had spent 2 years building walls around his heart, convinced that he would never trust anyone again, and then I had stumbled into his hotel room like something out of a dream, and everything he thought he knew about himself had begun to crumble. He told me that he loved me. The words hung in the air between us, fragile and precious, and I felt tears streaming down my face even as I shook my head and tried to pull away. I told him that he could not love me. I was nobody. I was a fraud. I was everything that Lady Arabella said I was, and if he stood by me, she would destroy us both. He pulled me closer, refusing to let me go, and he told me that he did not care. He did not care about society's opinion, or Lady Arabella's threats, or any of the obstacles that stood between us. He cared only about me, about the woman who had shown him that kindness and strength could exist in the same heart, about the woman who had taught him to laugh again, about the woman who had saved him from a half-life of loneliness and regret. I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to believe him. But I had been disappointed too many times, had learned too well that fairy tales were for children, and that women like me did not get happy endings. I told him that I needed time. Time to think, to understand, to decide what I truly wanted. And he nodded, his face grave, and he released my hands and stepped back and told me that he would wait. However long it took, he would wait. The days that followed were the longest of my life. I kept to my rooms, pleading illness, unable to face Benedict or the Dowager or anyone else. I lay awake at night, turning his words over and over in my mind, trying to understand how I had come to this moment and what I was supposed to do next. I thought about my father, about the way he had loved my mother with quiet devotion until the day she died, about the way he had told me stories of their courtship while he worked at his bench, his gentle voice weaving tales of romance and hope that had sustained me through the darkest times. He had believed in love, in its power to transform and redeem, and he had raised me to believe the same. But I also thought about the world I had seen since his death, the cruelty and indifference, the way people used and discarded each other without remorse. I thought about Lady Arabella's perfect smile and her casual threats, about the society matrons who whispered behind their fans, about all the forces arrayed against any future Benedict and I might try to build together. And I thought about Benedict himself, the way his eyes softened when he looked at me, the way his hand always found mine in crowded rooms, the way he had defended me, protected me, treated me with a respect and tenderness that I had never expected from a man of his position. On the fourth day, the Dowager came to my room. She did not knock. She simply swept in, as regal and commanding as ever, and seated herself in the chair by my window without waiting for an invitation. For a long moment, she said nothing, merely looked at me with those dark eyes that seemed to see everything. Then she told me a story. She told me about her own youth, about a time when she had been young and frightened and faced with an impossible choice. She had loved a man once, she said, a man who was not her social equal, a man her family would never have approved of, and she had chosen duty over love, had married the old Duke because it was expected of her, had spent 40 years in a marriage that was cordial but never passionate. She did not regret her choice, she said. Her life had been comfortable and privileged and full of many blessings. But there were nights still, when she lay awake and wondered what might have been, what life she might have lived if she had been brave enough to choose differently. She told me that she had watched her son fall in love with me, had seen the change in him, the lightening of his spirit that she had despaired of ever witnessing. She told me that she had not planned this outcome, not consciously, but that some part of her had perhaps hoped for it from the moment she had seen me standing bewildered in that hotel room. And she told me that she would not stand by and watch her son lose the woman he loved because of Lady Arabella's petty vindictiveness. She had been busy, she explained, while I had been hiding in my room. She had called upon old friends and collected old debts. She had gathered her own evidence, her own letters and testimonies, enough to ensure that Lady Arabella would think very carefully before making good on any threats. Society might be cruel, but it also had a long memory, and there were things in Lady Arabella's past that she would not want brought to light. The balance of power had shifted. Lady Arabella had been warned, and if I was willing, if I was brave enough, there was nothing standing between me and the future I wanted. I looked at this formidable woman, this aristocrat who should have despised everything I represented, and I asked her why. Why had she done all this? Why did she care whether I stayed or went? She smiled then, the first genuine smile I had ever seen on her face, and she told me that she cared because her son cared, because he was happy, truly happy, for the first time in years, and because, despite everything, she had come to care for me too. "You have spirit," she said. "You have strength. You remind me of myself when I was young and foolish and not yet crushed by the weight of expectations. Do not make my mistakes. Do not choose duty over love. Do not spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been." I found him in the garden, standing beneath the ancient oak tree that dominated the center of the grounds. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, and he was watching the light fade with an expression of such profound sadness that my heart ached to see it. The garden was beautiful at this hour, the flowers releasing their evening perfume into the cooling air, the shadows lengthening across the manicured lawns. I had walked these paths many times over the past weeks, sometimes alone and sometimes with Benedict, learning the names of the roses and the histories of the statues and the stories behind the carefully planned vistas. It had become one of my favorite places in all of Ashworth House, this sanctuary of green and growing things, and I knew it was one of his favorite places too. He turned when he heard my footsteps, and for a moment we simply looked at each other, all the words we needed to say suspended in the fragrant evening air. The light caught his features, softening them, making him look younger and more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. I wanted to reach out and touch his face, to smooth away the sadness that lingered there, but I did not dare. Not yet. Not until I had said what I had come to say. I spoke first. I told him that I had been afraid of trusting, of hoping, of allowing myself to want something that seemed impossible. I told him that I had spent so long surviving, just surviving, that I had forgotten how to dream. The words came slowly at first, then faster, tumbling out of me like water from a dam finally breached. I told him about my father, about the years of struggle after his death, about the way I had learned to expect nothing so that I could never be disappointed. I told him about the walls I had built around my own heart, walls just as high and just as thick as his. But I was tired of being afraid. I was tired of surviving. I wanted to live, truly live, and I could not imagine any life worth living that did not include him. His eyes widened as I spoke, the sadness in them slowly transforming into something else, something that looked like hope and wonder and a joy so fierce it was almost painful to witness. He took a step toward me, then stopped, as though afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the moment. He crossed the distance between us in 3 strides, and when he kissed me, it was nothing like our first gentle questioning kiss. This was a claiming, a promise, a declaration of intent that left no room for doubt or hesitation. I wrapped my arms around him and held on as though he were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become wonderfully, terrifyingly uncertain. When we finally broke apart, both of us laughing and crying and shaking with emotion, he told me that he had something to ask me. Then he dropped to one knee on the soft grass, still holding my hands, and he asked me to marry him. Not for 10,000 pounds, not for society's approval, not for any reason except that he loved me and wanted to spend the rest of his life proving it. I said yes. The word came out on a breath, barely audible, but he heard it. I saw the moment it registered in his eyes, saw the joy that bloomed there like a flower opening to the sun. He rose to his feet and gathered me in his arms, and we stood there beneath the ancient oak, wrapped in each other's embrace, while the last light of day faded around us and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "I love you," he whispered against my hair. "I love you, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret saying yes." I pulled back enough to look into his face, this face that had become so dear to me, and I told him that I could never regret it, that saying yes to him was the easiest and best decision I had ever made, that I had spent my whole life waiting for something without knowing what it was, and now I knew. It was him. It had always been him. I just had not met him yet. We stayed in the garden until the servants came looking for us, worried by our absence. We told them nothing that night, wanting to keep our joy private for just a little longer, but I suspect they knew. The looks they exchanged as they escorted us back to the house, the knowing smiles they tried to hide. Servants always know more than their employers realize. The Dowager was waiting in the drawing room when we returned, her expression carefully neutral. But when Benedict told her our news, when he announced that he had asked me to marry him and I had accepted, I saw something shift in her face. Pride, perhaps. Relief, certainly. And something that might have been vindication. The satisfaction of a plan that had succeeded beyond all reasonable expectation. She embraced me then, the first time she had ever shown me physical affection, and she whispered in my ear that she had known from the beginning, had known that I was exactly what her son needed, exactly the woman who could heal his wounded heart. She had taken a gamble, she admitted, but she had never truly doubted the outcome. I did not know whether to be grateful or outraged by her manipulation. In the end, I decided it did not matter. Whatever her motives had been, the result was the same. I was going to marry the man I loved, and nothing else seemed important. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, in the small chapel on the grounds of Ashworth Manor. It was nothing like the grand society spectacle that Benedict's first engagement had promised. The guest list was modest, comprising only those who genuinely cared for our happiness. The Dowager wept openly throughout the ceremony, though she would later deny it vehemently. And I wore a dress of simple ivory silk, beautiful in its restraint, that I had helped design myself. The chapel was small but beautiful, a stone building that had stood on the estate for 300 years, its stained glass windows casting colored light across the worn wooden pews. We had decorated it simply, with flowers from the estate gardens and candles that flickered in the gentle breeze from the open doors. There was no orchestra, no elaborate processional, just a small group of people who loved us and wished us well. I walked down the aisle alone, as I had no father to escort me, but I did not feel lonely. The faces that turned to watch me were warm with affection, and at the end of the aisle stood Benedict, looking at me as though I were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He wore a dark blue coat that matched his eyes, and his expression was one of such open joy that I felt tears prick my own eyes in response. The vicar spoke the ancient words, the promises that men and women had been making to each other for centuries, and I listened to them as though hearing them for the first time. To have and to hold, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. Each phrase seemed weighted with meaning, heavy with the commitment we were making to each other. When it was time to speak my vows, my voice trembled, but I did not falter. I looked into Benedict's eyes, and I told him that I would love him, honor him, and cherish him for all the days of my life. And I meant every word. His voice trembled too when he spoke his vows to me, and I saw tears glittering in his eyes. This man who had been so guarded, so reluctant to show emotion, was weeping at his own wedding, and the sight of it made my heart swell with love. Lady Arabella did not attend. She had left London shortly after the Dowager's warning, retreating to the continent to seek new hunting grounds. I did not spare her much thought. She had been a storm cloud on the horizon of my happiness, but she had passed without doing any lasting damage, and I had more important things to focus on, like the way my husband looked at me as I walked down the aisle, like the tremor in his voice as he spoke his vows, like the weight of the ring on my finger, a band of gold set with a single sapphire that had belonged to his grandmother and her grandmother before her. Like the life we were building together, stone by careful stone, day by precious day. The first months of our marriage were a revelation. I had expected that living with Benedict would be an adjustment, that we would stumble over each other's habits and irritations, that the passion of courtship would cool into something more practical and mundane. Instead, I discovered depths of joy I had never imagined possible. The days settled into a rhythm that felt both new and ancient, as though we had been living this life together for years rather than weeks. We would breakfast together in the small morning room, Benedict reading his correspondence while I reviewed the household accounts that Mrs. Thornton had taught me to manage. We would ride out in the afternoon, exploring the vast estate that was now my home, discovering hidden meadows and forgotten follies and views that took my breath away. We would dine together in the evening, sometimes with guests and sometimes alone, talking about everything and nothing until the candles burned low. I learned his habits, the small quirks that made him uniquely himself, the way he always took his tea without sugar but with more milk than anyone I had ever known. The way he hummed under his breath when he was thinking about a problem. The way he always checked that the doors were locked before retiring, a remnant of some childhood fear he would never quite explain. I learned these things, and I treasured them, because they were the pieces of himself that he shared with no one else. And he learned mine. The way I talked to myself when I was concentrating on needlework. The way I always had to have the curtains open, even on the coldest days, because I could not bear to be cut off from the light. The way I still flinched sometimes when someone approached me from behind, a reflex born of years of living in dangerous neighborhoods. He learned these things, and he never made me feel ashamed of them, never treated them as flaws to be corrected, but simply as parts of who I was. We talked for hours, about everything and nothing. We read aloud to each other in the evenings, taking turns with novels and poetry and the occasional scientific treatise that caught his fancy. We walked the grounds of Ashworth Manor in all weathers, learning the names of every tree and flower, discovering hidden corners where we could steal kisses like conspirators. We laughed more in those early months than I had laughed in all the years since my father's death. But there were difficult moments, too. Moments when the ghosts of our pasts refused to stay buried. Benedict still struggled with trust, still flinched sometimes when I reached for him unexpectedly, still had nightmares that left him pale and shaking in the darkness. I held him through those nights, murmuring reassurances, waiting patiently for the terror to pass. And he did the same for me, when my own demons came calling, when I woke convinced that everything had been a dream, and I was back in my rented room, alone and afraid. We healed each other, slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks and breakthroughs and everything in between. And with each passing day, the walls around his heart crumbled a little more, and the fear in mine grew a little quieter. There were moments of perfect peace, moments when I would look up from a book or a piece of embroidery to find him watching me, and the love in his eyes would take my breath away. There were moments of laughter, unexpected and joyful, when we would discover some shared absurdity that sent us both into fits of mirth. There were moments of tenderness, when one of us would reach for the other's hand without thinking, simply because the need for connection was too strong to resist. And there were moments of deeper intimacy, conversations in the quiet darkness of our bedroom, when we would share things we had never told anyone else. He told me about his brother, about the years of friendship that had preceded the betrayal, about the way that loss had shattered something inside him that he had feared would never heal. I told him about the last days of my father's life, about the way I had sat beside his bed and watched him fade, about the terrible empty silence that had followed his final breath. We gave each other our wounds, our fears, our broken places, and somehow, in the giving, we began to make each other whole. The Dowager remained at Ashworth Manor for several months after our wedding, overseeing my education in the management of a great household and ensuring that I would not embarrass the family with my ignorance of aristocratic protocols. But as winter approached and it became clear that I had mastered the essentials, she announced her intention to remove to the dower house and leave us to our own devices. I will miss her presence, she told me on the day of her departure, her sharp eyes suspiciously bright. I have grown accustomed to having someone sensible to talk to. I embraced her, this woman who had once terrified me, and I told her that she would always be welcome in our home. She sniffed disdainfully and told me not to be maudlin, but she did not pull away. And when she finally released me, there was a softness in her expression that I had learned to recognize as affection. The years that followed were not without challenges. Society's memory proved longer than the Dowager had hoped, and there were always whispers, always speculation about the mysterious woman who had captured the Duke of Ashworth. Some believed the story we had crafted about my origins. Others suspected the truth, but lacked the evidence to prove it. And a few, the kindest and most perceptive, simply did not care, accepting me for who I was rather than who I pretended to be. I made friends among the latter group, genuine friendships built on mutual respect and shared interests. Lady Helena Whitmore, whose husband owned the estate neighboring ours, became my closest confidant. A woman of sharp wit and generous heart who never once asked about my past but always celebrated my present. And Mrs. Adelaide Byrne, the vicar's wife, taught me the quiet art of charitable work, showing me how to use my new position to improve the lives of those who had nothing. I thought often about my father during those years, about what he would have said if he could have seen the life I was living. He would have been proud, I think, not of the title or the wealth, but of the love I had found and the person I had become. He had always believed that kindness and courage were worth more than gold, and I tried every day to live up to that belief. Benedict and I grew closer with each passing season. our love deepening into something richer and more complex than the initial intoxication of attraction. We argued sometimes, as all married couples do, about trivial matters and important ones. But we always found our way back to each other, always remembered that we were allies rather than adversaries, always chose understanding over pride. He told me once, on a quiet evening when we were sitting together in the library, that I had saved his life. Not literally, not in any dramatic sense, but in the way that mattered most. I had shown him that trust was possible, that love was worth the risk, that the wounds of the past need not define the future. He had been dying inside, he said, slowly and quietly, and I had brought him back to life. I told him that he had done the same for me, that I had been surviving, just surviving, putting one foot in front of the other without any sense of purpose or destination, that he had given me a reason to hope, a future to look forward to, a home in the truest sense of the word. We sat together in comfortable silence then, his hand warm in mine, the fire crackling softly in the grate. Outside, snow was falling, blanketing the world in white, and inside, we were safe and warm and together. This is not the end of our story. Stories like ours do not have endings, only new chapters, new challenges, new opportunities for growth and change. There will be difficulties ahead, I am certain of that. There will be losses and disappointments, and moments when we question whether we made the right choices. But there will also be joy. There will be laughter and love, and the quiet comfort of knowing that we face whatever comes together. There will be mornings waking in his arms and evenings watching the sunset from the terrace, and all the small, precious moments that make up a life. I entered a stranger's hotel room on a rainy night in Bath, a desperate woman with nothing to lose. I left that room as someone different, someone who dared to believe that she deserved happiness, that she was worthy of love, that her story did not have to end in poverty and obscurity. The price of my mistake was £10,000 and the chance to pretend to be someone I was not. What I gained was immeasurable. A husband who sees me, truly sees me, and loves what he sees. A mother-in-law who has become something like a friend. A life of purpose and meaning and connection, and hope. After so many years without it, I have hope again. That, I have come to understand, is worth more than all the gold in England. The spring following our first wedding anniversary brought changes I had not anticipated. The Dowager, despite her protestations of independence, had grown increasingly frail over the winter months. She refused to admit any weakness, of course, continuing to issue pronouncements and criticisms with her characteristic vigor. But I noticed the way she tired more easily, the way her sharp eyes sometimes dimmed with exhaustion. Benedict noticed too. He visited her at the Dower House every afternoon, bringing her reports on estate business and seeking her counsel on matters large and small. I accompanied him when I could, sitting with her in the drawing room while she dispensed advice and opinions with the authority of someone who had been managing aristocratic households since before either of us was born. One afternoon, as Benedict stepped out to speak with her housekeeper, the Dowager called me to sit beside her. Her voice was softer than usual, touched with something that might have been vulnerability. She told me that she was pleased with how things had turned out. Not just pleased, she amended, catching herself in the admission of genuine emotion. Satisfied. I had proven her initial assessment correct. I was exactly what her son needed, and she was grateful that she had lived long enough to see him happy. I took her thin hand in mine and told her that I was grateful too. Grateful for the chance she had given me, even if her motives had been complicated. Grateful for her guidance and her protection. Grateful most of all for her eventual acceptance. She squeezed my fingers with surprising strength and told me not to become sentimental. It did not suit either of us, but there was a warmth in her eyes that contradicted her words. And when Benedict returned a few moments later, she was smiling in a way I had rarely seen. That summer, society descended upon Ashworth Manor for a house party that had become something of an annual tradition. The guest list included many of the friends I had made over the years, as well as several acquaintances whose invitations were more political than personal. It was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure, a whirlwind of dinners and entertainments and endless small talk that left me craving the quiet evenings Benedict and I shared when we were alone. But there was one guest whose presence unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Lord Frederick Hale, Benedict's cousin and the nearest male relative after the late Lord Marcus, had travelled from his estate in the north to attend. He was a pleasant enough man, with an easy charm and a ready laugh, but there was something about the way he looked at me that made me uncomfortable. It was not improper exactly, more assessing than admiring, as though he were trying to understand something that eluded him. Benedict had warned me about Frederick before the party. He was ambitious, Benedict said, and not entirely trustworthy. He had hoped to inherit the dukedom before Benedict and Lady Arabella had become engaged, and he had never quite abandoned his resentment at being displaced. He bore watching. I watched him as instructed, and what I saw confirmed my husband's concerns. Frederick asked too many questions, showed too much interest in matters that were none of his business, and spent a suspicious amount of time in conversation with guests who were known gossips. I reported my observations to Benedict, and he thanked me with a kiss and a promise to handle the situation. The confrontation came on the final evening of the party, after the last guest had retired and the servants had begun the long process of restoring the house to order. I was in the library, too restless to sleep, when I heard raised voices in the hallway. I opened the door to find Benedict and Frederick facing each other in the dim corridor, their expressions equally fierce. Frederick was making accusations. He had done his research, he said. He had spoken to people in Bath, in London, in every corner of society where rumors might be gathered. He knew the truth about me, about our sham marriage, about the £10,000. And he was prepared to make that truth public unless Benedict agreed to certain concessions, a larger allowance, a voice in estate decisions, acknowledgement as the heir presumptive, until such time as Benedict produced an heir of his own. Blackmail. It was blackmail, pure and simple, dressed up in the language of family obligation. I stepped into the hallway before I could think better of it, and both men turned to look at me. Frederick's expression shifted to something like triumph, as though my presence confirmed everything he had suspected. Benedict's expression shifted to something like fear. But I was not afraid. I had faced worse than Frederick Hale in my life, had survived worse than the exposure of secrets I had long since ceased to be ashamed of. I walked to my husband's side and took his arm, and I looked Frederick directly in the eye. I told him to do his worst. I told him that I had nothing to hide, that I was proud of who I was and where I came from, that the story of my origins was one I would happily tell myself if anyone cared to hear it. I told him that Benedict had married me knowing everything, that our love was built on truth rather than deception, and that no amount of gossip could diminish what we had. And I told him that if he thought the Dowager Duchess would stand by and watch him threaten her family, he was even more foolish than he appeared. Frederick's triumph faded to uncertainty, and then to something like alarm. He knew as well as anyone what the Dowager was capable of when provoked. He knew the connections she had cultivated over 60 years in society, the secrets she kept, the debts she could call in. He had gambled that Benedict's pride would make him vulnerable, and he had miscalculated badly. Benedict spoke then, his voice cold and controlled in the way that always preceded his most decisive actions. He told Frederick that he would be leaving Ashworth Manor in the morning and that he would not be welcome to return. He told him that any attempt to spread rumors or make accusations would be met with swift and comprehensive retaliation. And he told him that if he ever threatened Cecily again, there would be consequences far worse than social ostracism. Frederick left the next morning, as instructed, and we never saw him again. He retreated to his northern estate and devoted himself to agricultural improvements and local politics, apparently having learned his lesson about tangling with the Hales. I heard later that he had married a sensible woman of modest fortune and settled into a quiet domesticity that seemed to suit him far better than scheming and manipulation. The Dowager was delighted when we told her what had happened. She had always suspected Frederick of being a snake, she said, and she was pleased to see her suspicions confirmed. More importantly, she was pleased by my handling of the situation. I had shown spine, she told me approvingly. I had not wilted or retreated or allowed myself to be intimidated. I had become, in her estimation, a true Duchess of Ashworth. Coming from her, it was the highest compliment imaginable. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and new sorrows, new challenges and new triumphs. Benedict and I celebrated anniversaries and mourned losses, weathered storms and basked in sunshine, grew older and wiser and more deeply in love with each passing day. The Dowager died peacefully in her sleep on an autumn morning when the leaves were turning gold. She was 83 years old and had, by her own account, lived exactly as long as she intended to. Her funeral was a grand affair, attended by half of society, and I wept openly throughout the service, not caring who saw. I inherited her pearls, the ones she had worn on the night we first met, along with a letter she had written sometime during her final months. In it, she told me that I had exceeded all her expectations, that I had become the daughter she had never had, and that she went to her grave content in the knowledge that her son was in good hands. I still wear those pearls on special occasions, a reminder of the fierce and complicated woman who gave me a chance when she had no reason to, who saw something in a bedraggled girl in a rain-soaked dress that no one else could see. Benedict and I established scholarships in her memory, funds to support promising young women from modest backgrounds who wished to pursue education or trade. It seemed fitting, somehow, to honor her legacy by helping others, as she had helped me. And when I visited the schools and workshops supported by our endowment, when I met the bright-eyed young women who reminded me so much of my younger self, I felt her presence still, approving and exasperated and proud. I have lived a remarkable life. I know that now, looking back over the decades, seeing the pattern that was invisible while I was living it. I was born to modest circumstances, orphaned by tragedy, reduced to poverty and desperation. And then, by a twist of fate that still seems improbable, I stumbled into a world I was never supposed to enter and found there the love of my life. It would be easy to attribute my good fortune to luck, to the fortunate timing of a storm and a clerk's error and a dowager's scheming mind. But I have come to believe that luck is only part of the story. The rest is courage, the willingness to seize opportunities when they arise, to take risks when the alternative is stagnation, to believe in the possibility of happiness even when all evidence suggests otherwise. I entered the wrong hotel room on a rainy night in Bath. It was a mistake, a blunder, the sort of mishap that could have ended in embarrassment and nothing more. Instead, it became the beginning of everything. Benedict is beside me now, as I write these words in the quiet of our library on a winter evening. His hair has gone silver at the temples, and there are lines around his eyes that were not there when we first met, but he is still the most handsome man I have ever known. He looks up from his book and catches me watching him, and he smiles, and in that smile I see all the years we have shared and all the years still to come. He asks me what I am writing, and I tell him the truth. I am writing our story, I say. The whole beautiful, impossible, improbable story, from that first bewildered morning to this peaceful evening and everything in between. He considers this for a moment, then rises from his chair and crosses to where I sit. He leans down and kisses me, softly, tenderly, with all the love that 2 decades of marriage have neither diminished nor made commonplace. Make sure you include the good parts, he says, the parts where I was charming and romantic and swept you off your feet. I laugh and promise that I will, though I reserve the right to also include the parts where he was stubborn and impossible and drove me to distraction. He laughs too, acknowledging the justice of this, and returns to his chair and his book. And I return to my writing, trying to capture in words what can never be fully expressed, trying to convey the depth and breadth of a love that has sustained me through everything. There was a moment, years ago, when I stood on a moonlit terrace and believed that I had nothing to offer a man like Benedict Hale. I was wrong. I had everything to offer. I had myself, my whole self, with all my flaws and fears and hidden strengths. And that, it turned out, was exactly what he needed. What we both needed. I will end this story where it began, with a woman standing in a stranger's room, uncertain of her future, afraid of what the morning might bring. That woman could not have imagined the life that awaited her, the love and loss and joy and sorrow, the transformation from seamstress to duchess, from survivor to someone fully alive. If I could speak to her now, across all the years that separate us, I would tell her to have courage. I would tell her that the path ahead is harder than she knows, but also more beautiful. I would tell her that the cold man with the wounded eyes will become the great love of her life, and that she will become his, and that together they will build something worth more than £10,000, worth more than all the gold in England. I would tell her that she is worthy of happiness, even when she cannot see it in herself. I would tell her that her story is only beginning, and then I would step aside and let her live it, every heartbreaking, heart-mending, miraculous moment, knowing that she will find her way to exactly where she needs to be. Because she did. Because I did. Because love, in the end, is always worth the price.